this point,
I
okay, but
I get it.
move these out your way.
Do me a favor, man. Don't reach in the bag, okay, man? No, you're good, man. I got you. Where are you going? Officer! Hey, come here! Stop right now! Come here! You're gonna get fucking tased!
Encounter begins the way so many low-level police contacts do. Not with a crime in progress, but with presence. A patrol unit pulls up to a closed business late at night and immediately frames the situation as irregular. This setting, a loner for hours. Private property. Dim lighting creates an asymmetry of power before a single command is given. From the very first seconds, the officers control the narrative simply by arriving. Two civilians, already aware they do not belong here, are forced into explanation mode. That dynamic matters, because once people begin explaining themselves, they are no longer equal participants in a conversation. They are subjects being evaluated. The initial questioning is casual on the surface, even conversational. A personal remark is mixed with a reminder that the business is closed. This blending of tone is not accidental. It lowers defenses while simultaneously asserting authority. The couple explains they were charging a phone. The explanation is mundane, plausible, and immediately conceded as technically improper. At this moment, the encounter could have remained a brief trespass warning. No damage, no complaint from a property owner, no allegation of theft or forced entry. The legal threshold for detention has not yet been crossed. But then the focus shifts. Something on the ground draws attention. A small object discarded, ambiguous, becomes the pivot point of the entire interaction. This is where discretion turns into leverage. The officer's attention locks onto the item, and with it, onto the woman standing closest. The questioning becomes sharper, more specific. The object is framed not as found property, but as a test of honesty. The officer does not merely ask what it is. He emphasizes the danger it poses to him personally. The narrative moves from "you shouldn't be here" to "you might hurt me," and that shift is powerful. Officer safety is one of the strongest justifications available in policing, and invoking it changes what comes next. The woman insists she picked the item up to avoid trouble. Whether that explanation is believed is almost beside the point. What matters is that the officer explicitly links the outcome of the encounter to truthfulness as he defines it. He states that paraphernalia alone is not his concern. Lying is a subtle but critical moment. By doing this, the officer reframes the situation so that compliance is no longer about behavior, but about aligning with his expectations. The standard is no longer legal guilt. It is credibility in the eyes of authority. Once that frame is established, everything that follows is filtered through it. The officer asks what the item would test positive for. The woman answers that. Answer, regardless of accuracy or context, locks her into a version of events that cannot be walked back. In trying to be cooperative, she narrows her own options. This is a common trap in police encounters. The more someone talks in an effort to appear honest, the more material there is to scrutinize. The physical separation follows quickly. The woman is moved to the front of the patrol car. She is told she is not under arrest, but she is clearly no longer free to leave. This is detention, even if it is not labeled as such. The language used, "hang out real quick," softens the reality of what is happening, but the commands are unmistakable. Hands on the hood. Questions, about sharp objects. The search begins not because a crime has been established, but because suspicion has been articulated. Meanwhile, the man remains nearby, watching the situation narrow around his partner. He is not the focus yet, but he is absorbing the same. Signals, authority asserting control, tolerance shrinking, stakes rising. He explains himself repeatedly, referencing an ankle monitor and the need to charge it. This information, intended to contextualize his presence, does the opposite. It introduces the justice system into the encounter. Supervision, status, conditions. Prior cases, all of it becomes relevant in the officer's calculus. What began as a possible trespass is now entangled with probationary oversight and compliance. When the officer notices additional items foil, containers, the tone hardens. Again. The warning about lying is repeated. This repetition reinforces that honesty is no longer a neutral concept. It is a test being administered. The woman explains the items belong to her husband. The officer responds not with acceptance or rejection, but with action. She is handcuffed and told she is being detained. Again, not under arrest yet. The distinction matters legally, but psychologically it is meaningless. Handcuffs erase nuance. They signal loss of control. At this point, the encounter has crossed a critical threshold. Both individuals are now acutely aware that their freedom depends on the officer's interpretation of events. The man is instructed not to reach into a bag. He complies. Seconds later, everything unravels. Without warning, the man moves away. From the scene, the movement is sudden, instinctive, and immediately framed as flight. The officer shouts commands. The camera jolts. What had been a static investigation becomes kinetic chaos. This is the moment selected as the opening hook, because it represents the irreversible shift from discretionary enforcement to criminalization. Running, regardless of motive, transforms suspicion into justification. From a legal perspective, flight is often cited as contributing to reasonable suspicion or probable cause. From a human perspective, it is frequently panic. In this case, the man later articulates exactly that. He is scared. He knows he is somewhere he should not be. He knows he is under supervision. He sees his partner in cuffs, the system closing. And around him triggers a survival response. But policing does not operate on psychological nuance in the moment. It operates on control. The pursuit is brief but violent. Commands are shouted. The man is taken to the ground. Apologies and pleas spill out as physical force is applied. The language from the officers becomes sharper, more punitive. The narrative hardens instantly. He ran for no reason, therefore he is responsible for everything that follows. This framing absolves the system of examining what conditions led to the decision to flee. The cause is collapsed into the act itself. Once on the ground, the power imbalance is absolute. The man is restrained, struggling, apologizing, repeatedly stating fear. The officers interpret movement as resistance. Resistance justifies more force. More force increases panic. Panic produces more movement. This feedback loop is one of the most dangerous dynamics in policing, and it plays out here in real time. The language escalates from control to threat. The objective is no longer de-escalation. It is compliance through dominance. Medical distress quickly enters the scene. The man reports dehydration, panic, inability to breathe properly. These statements are acknowledged but reframed as consequences of his own actions. You ran. Responsibility is placed squarely back on him. This is another common institutional reflex. Once someone is deemed non-compliant, their suffering is often interpreted as self-inflicted, even when it requires attention. As additional officers arrive, the scene stabilizes physically, but not emotionally. The woman is placed in the patrol car. The officers inventory items, discuss charges, and narrate their own actions to each other. This narration is important. It is not just communication. It is documentation in real time. They articulate why decisions were made, what was found, how the suspects behaved. This is the story that will later appear in reports, and it is being constructed while the subjects are still in shock. The officer explains how the woman picked up the item, how she answered his question, how paraphernalia was found. He emphasizes that they are not bad people, a phrase that sounds conciliatory but serves another purpose. It frames the outcome as unfortunate but inevitable, the result of choices rather than discretion. Running makes it worse. This logic is presented as self-evident, even though the initial authority to detain was already exercised. As the conversation continues, more layers emerge. There is mention of a domestic violence case, of conditions that prohibit contact, of Eve. Pre-trial release. What started as a minor property issue has now triggered a cascade of consequences. The system reveals itself not as a single interaction, but as an interconnected web. One stop touches another case, which affects another condition, which justifies another charge. Each piece compounds the last dot. The man explains his reasoning again. He panicked. He thought trespassing meant jail. He wanted to see his child. None of this changes the trajectory. The officers are no longer evaluating, they are processing. The decision tree has been completed. The outcome is locked in. Both individuals are going to jail. The language reflects finality. Questions from the detainees are met with statements, not explanations. By the end of this phase of the encounter, the transformation is complete. Two people who initially expected a warning are now fully absorbed into the criminal justice system. Charges are enumerated. Procedures are followed. Comfort is explicitly deprioritized. The restraints are acknowledged as uncomfortable, and that discomfort is normalized. The human element is secondary to the logistics of booking. What makes this case significant is not any single dramatic act, but the accumulation of small decisions. Each step is defensible in isolation. Checking a suspicious item, detaining for officer safety, reacting to flight. But together, they form a funnel that leaves no room for recovery once entered. The officers did not need to escalate immediately. They did not need to interpret every statement as a credibility test. They did not need to rely on fear as a compliance tool. Once the immediate physical struggle ends, the scene enters what might be called the administrative phase of force. This is the period where adrenaline settles just enough for officers to begin justifying, categorizing, and locking in what has already occurred. The danger, from an accountability standpoint, is that this phase often cements earlier assumptions into official fact. What was uncertain minutes ago becomes definitive simply because it is now written, repeated, and agreed upon by those in uniform. The man is on the ground, restrained, apologizing repeatedly. His language is not defiant. It is fragmented and desperate. He keeps returning to the same explanation, fear, panic. confusion about trespassing. But explanations no longer function as information. They are treated as noise. In police encounters, once a suspect's behavior has crossed into what officers classify as resistance or flight, the communicative value of speech collapses. Words stop being data and start being interpreted as excuses. This is a critical psychological shift. Early in the encounter, officers demanded honesty. Now, honesty is irrelevant. The outcome has already been decided. This illustrates a core imbalance in many policing interactions. The window in which cooperation can meaningfully alter events is often far smaller than civilians realize. People keep talking long after their words have lost power. The officer's language reflects this change. Commands are replaced by statements of inevitability. You're going to jail anyway now. This phrasing is revealing. It does not reference a specific statute or action. It references a state of being. Jail is no longer a consequence tied to a discrete offense. It is presented as the natural endpoint of the interaction. The suspect's confusion asking what he did wrong is met with frustration rather than clarification. From the officer's perspective, the explanation is obvious, running itself, legally. This is where the concept of resisting without violence comes into play. In many jurisdictions, fleeing from a lawful detention can constitute a charge, even if no physical aggression occurs. But this hinges on the dissension itself being lawful and clearly communicated. Here, the man was told moments earlier that his partner was not under arrest, that the situation was being figured out. The clarity of his own detention status is questionable. Yet ambiguity tends to favor the state, not the individual. As additional officers assist, the focus turns briefly to safety checks, ensuring nothing was dropped, nothing concealed. The language used is blunt, bordering on threatening. This is not unusual post-chase. Officers are trained to reassert dominance quickly to prevent further resistance. But this posture has consequences. It amplifies distress in already panicked individuals and increases the likelihood of medical or psychological emergencies. Those emergencies begin to surface almost immediately. The man reports dehydration, panic, physical distress. He struggles to regulate his breathing. These are classic signs of acute stress response. The officers acknowledge the symptoms but attribute them directly to his actions. This attribution is important. By framing distress as self-caused, the system minimizes its own responsibility to mitigate it. Aid becomes discretionary rather than obligatory. Water is mentioned. It is delayed. The request is not denied outright, but it is subordinated to procedure. This reflects a broader institutional priority. Control first, care second. Even when someone is restrained and no longer poses a threat, the emphasis remains on completing tasks rather than addressing discomfort. The logic is simple and deeply ingrained. If the person had complied, none of this would have happened. Meanwhile, the woman sits in the patrol car, largely silent. Her role in the encounter has shifted from active subject to collateral consequence. She did not run. She did not resist. Yet her fate is now tied entirely to what has occurred. Officers discussed items found, ownership, and shared responsibility. The idea of shared items becomes crucial. In the eyes of the law, shared access often means shared culpability. This doctrine allows officers to extend consequences broadly. Even when individual responsibility is unclear, the officer narrates the discovery process again, almost as if rehearsing it. This repetition is not accidental. It serves to reinforce the version of events that will later be scrutinized. Each retelling smooths over uncertainty. The phrasing becomes more confident, more declarative. The woman picked it up. She admitted what it would test for. Items were found during a search. The narrative becomes linear and clean, even if the reality was chaotic. An interesting moment occurs when the officer explicitly states they are not bad people. On its face, this seems compassionate, but in context, it functions as moral distancing. By asserting goodwill, the officer implies that the outcome is not punitive, but procedural. Jail is not a judgment of character. It is the result of choices. This framing shields the system from critique. If no one is bad, then no one is at fault except the suspects themselves. As the conversation continues, deeper legal complications emerge. The officer asks about a domestic violence case and whether the man is supposed to be with the woman. This introduces an entirely separate legal framework. Protective orders, pre-trial release conditions, and no-contact provisions carry strict liability. Intent does not matter. Consent does not matter. Presence alone can constitute a violation. The man attempts to explain that the contact was voluntary, that they are trying to reconcile. From a human standpoint, this is understandable. From a legal standpoint, it is irrelevant. This is where the system's rigidity becomes stark. The criminal justice system does not accommodate complexity well. Relationships are reduced to statuses. Orders are enforced mechanically. The officer tells him directly that he has violated conditions. The consequence is immediate and non-negotiable. The earlier trespass and paraphernalia issues now pale in comparison. The encounter has uncovered a violation that guarantees incarceration. The man's emotional state deteriorates further. He speaks about his son, about not having seen him in months, about how devastating this moment is. These statements are raw and deeply human. They also have no procedural value. Officers respond with statements about dirt already piled up, about how this isn't helping. The implication is clear. Emotional expression is not only useless, but potentially aggravating. The system does not pause for grief at this stage. The encounter illustrates one of the most troubling aspects of modern policing: how quickly officers transition from decision makers to messengers of inevitability. Early on, discretion existed. Warnings could have been issued. Detention could have ended. After the chase and the discovery of a supervision violation, discretion collapses. The officers are no longer choosing, they are enforcing. This allows them to emotionally detach from the outcome. They are not sending him to jail. The rules are, the suspects are informed again that they are both going to the same facility. Commands follow squat. Prepare for transport. The language is utilitarian. Comfort is explicitly dismissed. The restraints are acknowledged as uncomfortable, and that discomfort is normalized as part of the process. This normalization is key. It signals that suffering is expected and acceptable within the bounds of lawful custody. From an analytical perspective, what stands out is how the original justification for the encounter, the closed business, has completely disappeared. No one mentions it anymore. It has served its purpose as an entry point. The case is now about flight, resistance, paraphernalia, and supervision violations, This is how low-level enforcement expands. Initial reasons are not resolved. They are replaced. The final summary of charges underscores this expansion. The man is charged with resisting without violence, trespass, possession of paraphernalia, and violation of pre-trial release. Yet only one of these charges ultimately sticks. The others are dropped. This outcome reveals the gap between arrest, decisions, and prosecutorial review. Officers on the street operate with a lower threshold. Prosecutors later refine the case, discarding what cannot be sustained. This gap matters. Arrest itself is punishment, regardless of eventual dismissal. Jail time, stress, reputational damage, and disruption of family life occur long before a courtroom weighs evidence. In this case, the man pleads guilty to resisting. That plea likely reflects pragmatism rather than just scissor calculation too. Resolve the matter quickly rather than contest a system stacked against him. Looking back, the escalation feels less like a series of deliberate choices and more like a machine accelerating once activated. Each impotent object on the ground, an admission, a set of handcuffs, a moment of panic feeds the next stage. There is no reset button. Once momentum builds, it carries everyone forward, including the officers. What makes this encounter especially instructive is how ordinary it is. There is no extreme violence, no shocking revelation, no clear villain. Instead, there is process, policy, training, assumptions. The officers behave in ways that are largely consistent with institutional norms. And that is precisely the problem. When harmful outcomes arise from standard practice rather than deviation, accountability becomes diffuse and reform becomes difficult. By the end of Part 2, the outcome is effectively sealed. The physical struggle is over, but the damage is done. The system has asserted itself fully, and the individuals caught within it have little left to offer except compliance. What remains to be examined is not what happened. By the final phase of this encounter, everything that could harden has already hardened. The patrol lights are no longer symbols of inquiry but markers of custody. The officers' movements are slower now, more methodical. The chaos has resolved into procedure. This is often the point where viewers expect clarity, where the reason for everything finally becomes obvious. Instead, what emerges is something far more unsettling: the realization that clarity is not required for the system to move forward. The man is restrained, exhausted, and emotionally spent. His earlier panic has given way to resignation, punctuated by disbelief. He keeps returning to the same core question: what exactly am I going to jail for? And the answer remains diffuse. There is no single act that feels proportionate to the outcome. Trespassing at a closed business, being near discarded, paraphernalia, running out of fear, violating supervision conditions by being with someone he cares about. None of these, in isolation, explain the full weight of what is happening. Together, they form a web that is nearly impossible to untangle. This is one of the most important dynamics to understand in cases like this. The system does not require a central offense. It operates on accumulation. Each minor issue reinforces the others until the combined mass becomes justification enough. From the officer's perspective, the presence of multiple violations reduces doubt. From the subject's perspective, it feels like being buried under technicalities as the officers discuss logistics transport, booking, shared property, the language becomes almost bureaucratic. The emotional intensity that defined the earlier moments fades, replaced by routine. This emotional flattening is not indifference, it is adaptation. Officers are trained, implicitly and explicitly, to compartmentalize. Once a decision has been made, revisiting it is not only discouraged, it is seen as a risk. The woman's position illustrates this starkly. She is no longer actively questioned. Her role is passive, defined by association rather than action. The concept of shared items effectively erases individual narratives. In legal terms, constructive possession allows officers to attribute ownership based on proximity and access. In human terms, it collapses distinction. Nuance is sacrificed for efficiency. What is striking is how little effort is made to reassess the initial assumptions. No one returns to the question of whether the paraphernalia truly belonged to either of them. No one considers whether the encounter could have ended earlier. The system does not look backward once it has moved forward. Reflection is for courts and commentators, not the street. The officer's comments about comfort or the lack thereof are revealing. Acknowledging that restraints are uncomfortable while dismissing that discomfort as inevitable reinforces a key institutional message. Compliance is expected regardless of physical or emotional cost. This message is rarely stated outright, but it is reinforced through tone, timing, and response. Requests for relief are treated as inconveniences. Needs are reframed as consequences. The man's repeated references to his child cut through this procedural haze with painful clarity. He is not arguing law, he is expressing loss. The system has no language for this. There is no checkbox for parental longing, no statute that accounts for missed milestones. The officers respond with reminders of existing trouble, of how things are already bad. The implication is that his current suffering is just another entry in a long ledger of poor choices. This framing is powerful and dangerous. By constructing a narrative of inevitability of someone already buried under plenty of dirt, the system absolves itself of responsibility for adding more weight. If someone is already marked as problematic, additional harm feels less consequential. This is how cumulative disadvantage operates in real time. The final moments before transport are telling. The suspects are positioned, instructed, prepared for movement. There is no longer any discussion of alternatives. The officers speak to each other, not to the individuals. Decisions are communicated, not debated. This is the point where the encounter fully transitions from human interaction to institutional processing. When the charges are later summarized, the contrast between initial severity and final outcome becomes clear. Only one charge survives. The others are dropped. This discrepancy exposes a fundamental truth about policing. Arrest thresholds are far lower than conviction thresholds. Officers are empowered to act on suspicion, on interpretation, on perceived risk. Prosecutors, constrained by evidentiary standards, often narrow the case dramatically. But this narrowing does not undo what has already happened. The arrest itself is a life event. Time in custody, stress, fear, physical pain, public exposure, all of it occurs regardless of eventual dismissal. For people already under supervision, the consequences multiply. Missed appointments, violated conditions, extended oversight. The system's impact radiates outward, affecting families and futures. The man pleads guilty to resisting without violence. On paper, this looks like accountability. In reality, it often represents surrender. Contesting such a charge requires time, money, and emotional stamina. For someone already entangled in the system, a plea can feel like the only viable exit. The plea resolves the case, but it does not resolve the underlying issues that led to the encounter. From an analytical standpoint, the most troubling aspect of this case is not the chase or the force, but the predictability. Every step follows a familiar pattern. Officers escalate suspicion. Detention becomes control. Control triggers panic. Panic justifies force. Force uncovers additional violations. Violations eliminate discretion. Jail becomes inevitable. At no point does the system meaningfully pause. This predictability is reinforced by training, policy, and culture. Officers are taught to prioritize safety, control, and compliance. They are rewarded for enforcement, not for restraint. Metrics rarely capture de-escalation opportunities that were avoided rather than taken. In such an environment, the safest choice for an officer is often the most aggressive one, because it is the most defensible after the fact. The opening hook moment, the sudden flight and pursuit encapsulates this entire dynamic. It is the instant where fear meets authority, and authority responds with force. Everything before that moment set the stage. Everything after it followed, inevitably. The system does not ask why someone runs. It asks how fast officers responded. This case also highlights the fragile nature of rights in practice. Theoretical protections, reasonable suspicion, probable cause, proportional response exist within a framework that heavily favors law enforcement interpretation. For civilians, especially those with prior involvement in the system, these protections can feel abstract. Compliance does not guarantee safety. Honesty does not guarantee leniency. Silence can be interpreted as guilt, speech as deception. In the end, what remains is not outrage, but clarity. This is not a story about a single bad decision or a single bad actor. It is a story about how systems behave under stress, how authority consolidates itself, and how ordinary people are swept along by processes they do not control. The officers likely believe they acted appropriately. The man likely believes he never had a chance. Both perceptions can coexist. The lesson here is not simple, and it is not comforting. Low-level encounters carry high stakes. Panic is punished, even when it is understandable. Discretion narrows rapidly when suspicion is activated. And the consequences of an arrest extend far beyond the charges that survive on paper. By the time the transport doors close, the outcome feels settled, almost mundane. But the mundanity is the most alarming part. This is not an aberration. It is a routine expression of how power operates on the street. Quietly, efficiently, relentlessly. And that is why this footage matters, not because it is extreme, but because it is ordinary.